All right, so we spent the past couple of days talking about interest rates and banking, and I wanted to go a little bit of a step further and talk about who decides interest rates and are they made up? So let's recap some of the stuff we've taken a look at over the past few days. So, first, we talked about financial markets in the most recent video, so things like banks, and we talked about how their job is to connect savers' money to borrowers' loan needs. So they take the money that people save in the banks and they connect them with borrowers who want loans. And we also talked about interest, and we talked about how banks will pay savers interest. So if you keep your money in a bank, they will pay you interest to do it. But if you take out a loan, they will charge you interest because they charge borrowers interest. But how do they figure out interest rates? How would they make that choice? And ultimately, supply and demand is our answer. Our old BFFs that we've always been talking about in econ and are once again making an appearance. But one thing that I wanted to stipulate is in this particular module, we will be talking about real interest rates, which is sort of the overall national rate. It's sort of like the nation will ultimately come up with the interest rate that fits for everything, and then banks themselves will like bump it up in order to like charge higher interest than the real interest rate is. So in some ways, it's kind of made up if you're looking at the bank's interest rates. But for this particular module, we're going to look at the real interest rate. So first, here is a graph that should look pretty familiar to you. This is your pretty run-of-the-mill supply and demand graph, and that's because the loanable fund stuff works with supply and demand just like everything else does. The one thing that I want to keep in mind here to help define how this graph works is that over here, this axis on the bottom here is the dollar amount of loanable funds in the economy. And on this side over here is normally where price would be, but in this case is where the interest rate would be. So, of course, prices are motivating for people because it's how they get their money, right? If you're selling a thing, your price is what motivates you and how you get your money. But if you're talking about loanable funds, your interest rates is what motivate you because that's how you get your money. So it's kind of the same. It works very similar. So, but in this case, it's interest rates, and I just want you to keep that in mind. And another thing to keep in mind is if we're looking at this supply in this graph, what supply ultimately means is that the supply is the supply of dollars that people will want to save. So supply is pretty much looking at savers, the saver side of the equation, and demand is looking at the borrower side of the equation. So demand is all of the dollars that people will want to borrow, sort of based on this whole interest rate stuff and based on the amount of dollars that are in the economy. Um, so let's move on. That probably makes a bunch of sense to you. You're used to seeing the supply and demand stuff and how they sort of intersect, and how ultimately when the lines cross is where we sort of find the interest rates. But what makes the line shift? We know that when it comes to supply and demand, that there are changes in demand and changes in supply that will ultimately make stuff shift. So, what causes it in this situation with loanable funds? Well, the answer is pretty much government budget stuff, and most specifically taxes. Taxes are usually the thing that will ultimately cause supply to shift or demand to shift here. And so, we're going to take a look at how taxes on interest earnings and how tax credits for types of investments work. I'll break these down one at a time. So, first, let's take a look at taxes on interest earnings. And ultimately, what that means is that banks and the government, I guess, really, the government charges taxes on the earnings that people make from interest. So if you save money in a bank, the money that you get from interest, they'll charge you taxes on that because, hey, there's taxes on most stuff. Um, but let's take a look at how these taxes on the interest earnings can ultimately affect this graph. Um, so ultimately, it's fairly straightforward, and if you use a little bit of critical thinking, you can pretty much figure it out. But if the government decides that they want to lower the taxes on your interest of your savings, ultimately the supply of funds is going to go up. people are going to be, if you're making even more money because less money is being taken out, people are going to be more motivated to save. So let's take a look at this graph again and our old equilibrium price. Now we had our old price kind of right here in the center where the two lines crossed, our old supply and our old demand. And then let's say that the government went ahead and they decided to lower the taxes rate on interest rates. Well, ultimately, what that's going to do is, if you look at this box over on the right hand side, if taxes are lower, people are going to make even more money from their interest because there's less taken out by taxes. So it's going to be even more motivating. More people are going to want to save. So it makes this whole line shift. Basically, at the same interest rate, the interest rate stays the same. The interest rate, stays the same. At the same interest rate, more people will be willing to to save because they'll be earning even more money. It's more motivating. So what that means is if people are more willing to save at the same interest rates, then the whole line shifts. And then now, when we're looking at the equilibrium price, we can see that since the whole thing shifts, it kind of shifts from this point on the line to now it matches over here. So when we're talking about, trying to match the supply and how many funds are available to how many funds are going to be requested, now the equilibrium has shifted down here. And so what that means is since supply has gone up, we can see that with our graph that the amount of funds in the economy has gone up. So there's even more money because people are supplying more money. That's a pretty much a no-brainer, right? But what it means now is that the interest rate has dropped. Now, in order to balance the supply with the fact that now you're going to need more people demanding in order to match, the perfect sweet spot there is to drop that interest rate. And so ultimately, when taxes go down, ultimately the real interest rate will also go down to match, to make sure that the amount of people supplying funds will meet the amount of people that are demanding it at ultimately this interest rate. So let's go back. And we'll talk about the thing that will affect demand, thing that will affect the amount of borrowers and how many people will want to borrow these funds. And ultimately, that's an issue of tax credits for different types of investments. So occasionally, what the government will do is if they are interested in a particular type of investment, in things like solar, so the government wants more people to invest in that technology or wants more people, to start businesses in that realm. Basically, what they'll do is they'll say, all right, guys, anybody that's doing anything in solar, we'll cut you a break on taxes. We'll charge you fewer things. So let's jump down to our other graph to take a look see at how that looks for demand. And this one, once again, if you're a critical thinker, you can pretty much figure this one out. Ultimately, if there are more tax credits, if the government is giving more deductions, they're giving more coupons, basically more coupons, then the demand's going to go up. People are going to get more savings. People are going to be more excited about potentially investing, and they're going to want to borrow even more money. It's pretty simple. As you can see in this box over here, tax breaks make people more willing to invest. If they're going to get, a tax break, if all of a sudden, wow, it's even cheaper to invest and start a solar business, more people are going to want to do it, and they're going to need to borrow money to start those businesses or to kickstart those investments. So once again, we're still looking at this same graph of, supply and demand, and once again, it shifts in exactly the same way as demand shifts in any other thing. So we'll imagine in this scenario that the government decided to raise their tax credits. So now it's even cheaper to invest in some businesses. So now demand is going to go up. The whole line is going to shift at the same availability of money down here. The same availability of money. Even more people are going to want to check it out. More people are going to want to be involved in that business. More people are going to want to borrow. And so since that whole line shifts, just like it did before, the equilibrium price is no longer down here where it was with old demand. It starts to shift. In order for people to meet the new demand, we're going to have an even larger supply. So you can see we're further up on this supply line. So in order for it to break even, it'll now be at this. In order for our supply to meet our demand, our new raised demand, it's going to be up here. Equilibrium's up here. And ultimately, you can see that if there's higher demand, and it needs more supply, it's going to push up this amount of money that's in here. You can see